If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 451, Progress and Potential God. That is what Nick had been doing for most of the month after the first blitzball match ended, and he had made several great strides in his digestion of Slytherin's recorded knowledge. The first of them was that he had gained a more pronounced understanding of the ancient spell-casting method that was used at that time. It was similar to how the Celebrimbor style used his will and knowledge to enchant things, except this used those to create a spell from one's wand. His mastery of the Celebrimbor translated over well, but still left several gaps in his use of the spell-casting style that Slytherin's library was patching up nicely. The second great stride he made was learning the rituals that Slytherin himself used during his youth to grow his power, as well gain a few benefits that Nick thought would be handy. One of the rituals was the ritual of nature that Nick had himself undergone. But there was also another two rituals that Slytherin used that, while not directly growing his power, sped up his magical growth drastically. The first was the ritual of expansion that caused one's magical core to grow smaller but produce more dense mana, despite what the name would have you think. The requirements for this ritual was to sacrifice 4 limbs, a torso, and a head each from different magical beasts. The one casting the ritual also needed to soak the location of their magical core in a special potion for 7 days and 7 nights before undergoing the ritual. The second ritual Nick found was the ritual of clarity that strengthened one's mana circuits, allowing them to endure greater stress without leaking mana. This ritual was thankfully a simple one that involved a few rare plants, but that was it really beyond the timing that needed a full moon. There were a few other new rituals that Slytherin underwent, but none of them really appealed to Nick beyond those two. The third great stride was the discovery of the potential sealing location for one of the remaining gods. Slytherin had apparently been a part of a group of wizards that joined together to explore ancient tombs or mysterious magical places. The location of the sealed god was in what was known as Snaeland at the time, but was in modern times referred to as Iceland. Slytherin records that the location of the impenetrable magical tomb was located under a large glacier at the southernmost part of the land near a volcano. The tomb had only been discovered originally after a wizard had been searching for a certain magical beast in this area, but was caught in an ambush by an enemy, and the crossfire blasted some ruins into view. The wizard then sought out helpers to explore this new set of ruins after dispatching their enemy. Slytherin later placed concealment wards over the place once they failed to get past the horrible magical traps that were made of metal. To Nick, this sounded like the work of the smith god Hephaestus, as neither of the other two sealed gods had any affinity with crafting traps, much less metal, from Nick's understanding. Iceland was also isolated enough that Nick could see an scorned individual like Hephaestus holing up there. The possibility of the place not being a sealed god's location but a genuine tomb for a very powerful wizard was also equally possible, but something told Nick he needed to visit the place to know for sure. Looks like I need to plan a trip to Iceland, he thought with a sigh. Besides all that, though, Nick was mostly absorbing the various theories and rules that Slytherin recorded in his library for the various different fields of magic he knew. The greatest of which was Slytherin's studies on healing magic that, while dark in some parts, were comprehensive if nothing else. The man was thorough in his experiments on captured foes or muggles that stumbled across him, and had detailed notes on what did what to who and why it did that. Nick absorbed this information like a sponge and was confident that he would be able to put many witches to shame by the time he fully absorbed Slytherin's knowledge. By the start of December, Nick was practically a different person from how much progress he made into the library, and it showed. He felt older to those around him, like he had seen ages come and go. There was nothing for it, unfortunately, as when you read someone's entire life, including their inner thoughts on a subject, their personality will inevitably rub off on you to a degree. Slytherin was a calculative and callous person that was a firm believer of the ends justifying the means, and a small part of that had been taken into Nick's own personality. Chapter 452, Ignored Rule. This change hadn't gone unnoticed by his friends, and Ron was the first to confront him on it. "Is everything all right, Nick? You've been a bit odd of late," the redhead asked in the workshop on the 1st of December. "Yeah, everything's fine, my schedule is just getting to me, I suppose," Nick said with a sigh. "Don't you only have class 2 days a week, though?" Tracy asked, confused. "Not that schedule, the one I set for myself when I am not in class or here making rings of protection," Nick specified. "Sounds like you need to take a break from whatever part of this schedule of yours that has you acting uncomfortably similar to Snape," Daphne said seriously, and everyone nodded. Nick didn't argue, since if it was that bad he probably should take a break from Slytherin's library for a while. "Maybe I should hold another match," Nick suggested, and everyone perked up. "Oh yeah? You wouldn't believe how many people ask the rest of us when you would be holding another one of those," Tracy complained. "I assumed that the teams would have scheduled one by now, since that is how it works if there isn't a tournament," Nick said with a shrug. "You never said that," everyone yelled at the same time. Nick shook his head. No, it's on the rules I wrote, see. He said while pulling out the rules handbook that had been published by the ministry. Flipping through it to the last page, Nick pointed at the rule he was talking about. All non-tournament matches are to be decided upon by the teams participating beforehand. Why in Merlin's name is that the last rule? Tracy exclaimed in frustration. Nick shrugged. I wrote the rules assuming that they would all get read, so it's not my fault nobody did. He said with a chuckle. His friends all left after that to spread the word on this rule that had been overlooked this entire time through the school. Nick found it a bit funny how much of an uproar this created, as everyone who had been hoping for a new match to watch confronted the teams themselves over it. The team captains all looked like they ate lemons with the sour expressions they had. The best part is that they had no one to blame but themselves for not paying attention to that rule. So it was that a new match was finally announced between the Mermen and the Krakens for the upcoming Saturday. The funny thing was that only the students and those who hadn't read the entirety of the rules didn't know about the scheduling rule. The rest of the world that had started training teams and assembling the fields using Nick's blueprints was actually aware of this rule and using it to thoroughly prepare for the first official international tournament in the future. Nobody knew exactly when it was going to be held, but there were rumors that the international Quidditch tournament was going to be held with it as well. Nick relaxed during the week when he wasn't making rings or in class by hanging out with his friends and slowly digesting the information within the Daedric Realm book he had. Hermione kept bothering him about it when she caught a glimpse of the dense scrawl in the book. Stuff about how he should stop reading something written in demonic lettering, and hypocritically curious what it was about. It was funny to everyone how her two sides clashed so heavily with this topic, as she wanted him to be safe but at the same time her inner knowledge hound wanted to know what information was held within. Obviously Nick didn't tell her what the book was about, since for one it was so over her head that it wasn't even possible for her to understand. Second, he was planning to use the nigh immortality of binding himself to the realm as his ace in the hole for the future. After all, he doubted that anyone, even Zeus, would expect someone they killed to suddenly come out of nowhere in a surprise attack. Unlike Hades, Zeus had no known connection to souls, so he probably wouldn't even notice it if he destroyed Nick's body, but the soul slipped away safely. Nick had thought of trying to grant his friends immortality or at the least agelessness, but figured he should wait until after he dealt with Zeus for that sort of thing. In an excellent piece of news, there was a thunderstorm predicted to come in a few days, and Nick was ready to take the step forward into becoming an animagus. Chapter 453, Animagus Transformation. Nick was confident that he would finish the ritual without any trouble thanks to his preparations. Still, he wanted to be in his best condition for the day he started the transformation, and thus didn't do anything that taxed him in any way. He simply spent the next 3 days hanging out with his friends and helping them with their homework and personal projects. Ron, for example, was experimenting with cores to see if he could find another supreme core besides those that Ollivander has listed. Nick doubted that this would turn up anything, considering that Ollivander definitely conducted similar experiments before. Tracy was focusing on fully mastering the basics of metalwork, while Daphne and Hermione were starting to experiment with creating runic lines without help. Nick had to point out the few horrible mistakes they made a few times, but overall it was fairly good work. Harry and Luna were instead focused on personalizing their combat styles. This was more complex than it sounded, as while using the generally taught form of magical combat could take one far, it was a fact that the real powerhouse fighters like Dumbledore and Grindelwald had their own styles. The reason for this was that people were each different than each other, and thus even if it was small, the style used should change to fit the one using it. For Harry this showed up in the form of focused attacks but loose wand movement. For Luna it was a sort of organized chaos with a vast mix of wand movements and body positions. Out of the two, Luna's developing style was by far the hardest to come against. It was a bit like trying to fight the currents of an ocean or the movement of the wind. Sure, you could shift it but never stop it entirely, as both of those things were fluid and ever adapting to whatever was placed before them. It was actually quite impressive, as Luna went from being almost on par with Harry to suppressing him 6 times out of 10, and that number was only growing as she further refined her style. Soon enough though, the day finally came, and as promised, lightning flashed across the sky from the storm. Nick retrieved the potion that had turned a strange mushy purple and, ignoring the disgusting contents, downed it. Immediately he felt an intense heat rise from his stomach and spread throughout his body as if it was traveling through his veins. Ba-dum. The sound of a heartbeat rang out from Nick's body, and while most would assume it came from his heart, he knew for certain that it wasn't the case. No, the sound came from his magical core, and then once again it appeared. Ba-dum. Ba_dum. Ba-dum. The sound grew more and more frequent as the heat spread throughout his body until it seemed to echo from how often it appeared. Once the heat fully spread through Nick's body, the real changes started to happen. The familiar phenomena that he had incorporated into the ritual arrived as pain racked his body and soul. His skin grew thicker and the fine hairs all over his body grew into feathers. His fingers fused together and his arms elongated while the bones became lighter but stronger throughout his body. His teeth grew outwards alongside his jaws before fusing together into a sharp beak. Nick's feet hardened and his big toe and pinky toes fused with the toes next to them while the middle toe grew wider and longer. The final large change was that Nick's entire body began to swell in size while the proportions shifted into their new form. The transformation took nearly an entire hour, and when it finally ended, a 7-foot-tall bird with silver gray and golden feathers with black patterns and 2 sets of wings and long tail feathers stood within the room. Seer! The bird cried out, and the storm raging outside froze as if by command for the briefest moment. In the workshop, Dusk cried out as well, while in Dumbledore's office Fawkes did the same. So he succeeded then, I can't wait to see what form he took. The old wizard said with a small smile. Nick meanwhile calmed himself down after that instinctual cry of joy at his finished transformation. It's odd how natural this feels. It's like I have always known how to walk with talons and fly with 4 wings. Nick though, as he felt out his new form's movements. Let's give that a go to see if my theory on where Nazgul got it from is correct, he thought before there was a bright flash of electric energy and he was gone. Almost at the same time there was another bright flash of electric energy at the Blitzball field ring as he manifested there. Chapter 454, Chat. Whoa! That's disorienting as all hell. Nick thought as his mind registered the complete shift in environment. The snow falling from the sky melted on contact with his feathers as his body actively radiated a great deal of heat on its own. Nick noticed this but thought it made sense if he was what he thought he was. So I was right, and Nazgul did get the elemental teleportation from the celestial bird part of me. He thought before mentally grinning as he spread his wings and flapped them hard. Whoosh! A powerful gust of wind was created, pushing the falling snow aside from the power of this movement. Nick shot into the air as he flapped his wings and couldn't help but be happy to fly without any outside assistance. It was hard to describe really, as it was like a weight had been lifted from him and he suddenly felt light enough to touch the clouds above. Seer! He cried out as he poured on more and more speed. To his surprise, fire and lightning rose from his body as he pushed his speed to the limit before he felt something shatter and he watched the surroundings blur. Did I just break the sound barrier? He thought in amazement as he barely felt any resistance from the air at all despite reaching such a speed. He could still make out the surroundings as he passed by, but he couldn't focus on anything for more than a moment before it was already behind him. I shouldn't get too far from the school since I still need to turn back to normal, he thought as he banked sharply and unnaturally fast thanks to his second set of wings. Thanks to the storm it was quite dim outside the castle, so when Nick re-entered its proximity he drew a lot of attention. It would be rather difficult to ignore a brightly lit giant avian creature flying stupidly fast outside the windows after all. Nick slowed down, which also caused the flames and lightning covering him to retreat within his body as he saw Dumbledore watching him from the astronomy tower. Landing gracefully on the unoccupied spot on the tower, Nick looked down at the headmaster smugly. I admit that it really is an extraordinary form that well suits you, but remember that there is a reason wizards are considered superior. Dumbledore said sternly. Nick's form rippled and he returned to his normal state, with a small difference in that his nails remained hard and dark in color. Way to kill the mood, and here I was enjoying myself. Nick complained before they chuckling. Out of curiosity, how'd you know to wait for me here? He then asked, confused. Fawkes was quite vocal in celebrating your success, which told me all I needed to know. Dumbledore said honestly. Species resonance, hey? Nifty. Nick said, surprised to a degree, but after thinking about it, it made sense. Immortal birds were all highly independent, so it makes sense that they could feel the proximity of other members of their races. Otherwise there would probably be a lot of incidents involving them fighting, considering the global traveling the phoenixes do on the regular. So is this the part where I hand over the modified ritual to you so you can turn into a phoenix or not? Nick asked casually. What would make you think I want that? Dumbledore asked with a look of interest. Please don't act like not being able to take the form of your patroness was not the only reason you, a master of transfiguration, haven't undergone the ritual yourself. Nick said with a scoff. Dumbledore chuckled. I cannot deny that, but I am not the sort to take the hard-earned merit of another. He said with a small smile. Oh, believe me, I know, which is why I am waiting for you to make an offer for the knowledge instead. Nick said casually. It seems like you understand me quite well, and yet I find you difficult to fully decipher. Don't misunderstand me, I hold you in high regard for the way you act despite your many talents and power. You are arrogant, true, but compared to how you could be instead, it is far from unacceptable. Dumbledore said bluntly. Nick was taken off guard by this, as like himself Dumbledore prefers to speak vaguely most the time. Still Nick couldn't deny that the old goat was right, however, as while he was quite prideful he could be so much worse considering his unique situation. Be that as it may, I believe we are getting off topic. The ritual, Nick reminded, and Dumbledore smiled. You'll have to forgive me, I tend to get caught up in my thoughts during a conversation. Yes, I would like to use your ritual, but under the condition it not be made public, he said calmly. Chapter 455, Negotiation. Nick scoffed at that. I can't even reveal my own transformation at the moment, why would I reveal yours and make people suspicious? Not saying you aren't skilled or anything, but you haven't made any publicly known strides in magic in a long time, and yet you suddenly figured out how to turn into a magical creature via the animagus ritual. Suspicious as hell, Nick said honestly. I suppose you are right, but it wouldn't be the first time you've used my past to cause me harm, Dumbledore pointed out with a chuckle. Nick winced at that. That might have been a bit far in hindsight, but to be fair, you crossed that line first, he said honestly. I suppose I did, but enough beating the bush, as the Muggles say. We have a trade to make, Dumbledore said, butchering a phrase while he was at it. It's beating around the bush, and yet we should probably get this over with. Remove the age limit for the tournament next year and I'll call it even, Nick said with a shrug. This seemed to catch Dumbledore off guard, as he hadn't expected Nick to even know about the Triwizard Tournament, much less one of its rules. Ironically, that alone will not allow you to participate in the tournament, as the other two schools participating have insisted that you not be allowed to participate, Dumbledore said honestly. It was Nick's turn to be caught off guard this time, as he wasn't expecting something like this at all. Have they said why they don't want me to participate? He asked curiously. I believe the consensus reached was for the fairness of the other participants, though I imagine it is more likely because they lack confidence of victory should you participate, Dumbledore said honestly. Well, as it would happen, I wasn't planning to participate personally for that exact reason. I am not a fan of bullying after all. No, in fact I was hoping to have Harry take part instead, Nick explained calmly. Dumbledore looked confused. While he shows a high level of proficiency in dueling, I don't see any indication of him being ready for such a challenging endeavor, the old goat said seriously. Do you know what is holding Harry back the most right now in regards to his magical capabilities? Nick asked, and Dumbledore shook his head. It's experience and imagination. Harry's journey as a wizard has been fairly smooth past the first year, and as a result he lacks the experiences and creativity that would have accelerated his prowess by leagues at this point. He is ahead of most other third-year students, but nowhere near where he would be if he had been given true challenges to overcome, Nick said honestly. This was true too, as by this point in the canon timeline Harry was already learning the Patronus charm and showing off incredibly amounts of mana for his age. Now however Harry was more skilled with what he knew but lacked the edge he had in the canon timeline. Dumbledore seemed thoughtful after hearing this and could understand why Nick would think it. Conflict made strong wizards while peace made weak wizards, that brought conflict in an endless cycle. The key was to have enough conflict for growth but not enough to spark trouble. You hope that the tournament might help Harry grow further then? An admirable idea, but what of Harry's own wishes in the matter? Perhaps he won't want to participate in the tournament to begin with. What then? Dumbledore asked, and Nick chuckled. Then that will be up to him. I only want to allow him the opportunity to reach his full potential. Whether he takes it or not is entirely up to him, Nick said with a shrug. I see. Very well, then I shall see to it that the age requirement be lowered accordingly. After that, however, it will be up to Harry to enter the tournament or not, Dumbledore said with a smile. Nick casually took out a sheet of parchment and handed it over. Just so you know, I had planned to give you the ritual regardless of what I got out of it, since it will prove useful to me in the future, Nick said before jumping off the tower and turning back to his animagus form. There was one detail that even Dumbledore may have forgotten to think about if he succeeded in becoming a Phoenix Animagus. He may get the chance to exploit the magic to a degree and undergo nirvana like normal phoenixes do, which will return him to his prime without lowering his power at all. Nick however knew that he didn't have this option, since his very being will be tied to his realm instead, so he will be reconstituted from scratch while Dumbledore will have to go through the youth stage again. Chapter 456, Hopeful Solution. This entire time since the creature escaped from its prison, it had been moving slowly through the sea as it hunted down the magical beasts that dwelled within. All magic was its food and nothing was an exception, so it was only after it stopped finding prey that its hunger finally led it to the northeastern shores of the British Isles. There it came across its first wizard after it left the prison, that it devoured with relish. This was merely the first of many, however, as it was soon discovered by the Ministry and by extension Dumbledore. Stopping it however proved impossible, as even transfigurations that reshaped the ground it stood upon lost their magic and reverted to their original states. Nick learned of this when he and the powerful staff of Hogwarts was summoned to Dumbledore's office after the man had managed to send the creature to the northern Arctic Circle at the cost of most of his mana. The creature is as we feared and unable to be contained by magic. I tried everything I could but I was only barely able to catch it off guard enough to banish it to the Arctic glaciers, but it is already on its way back, with a grudge this time it seems. The old man said with a tired look on his face. My hands are also tied in this matter, as without causing a serious commotion I have no way of taking care of the thing. In theory it would be possible to use Muggle science to trap the creature, but they lack the level in it to make that possible. Nick said helplessly. Why did you want a Muggle weapon then? Dumbledore asked, confused. That was because it burns through its magic each time it stops a non-magical attack, so it might be possible to force it to starve itself to death if it is hit with enough. Nick said honestly. Would that not put the one using the Muggle weaponry in grave danger as the creature grew desperate? Snape asked with a heavy frown. That's where I am stuck, unfortunately, as to nullify the danger I would need a way trap the creature, and as Dumbledore will attest that is not possible magically speaking. Using Muggle means also won't work, as the thing will barely be slowed down with the current level of technology available. Nick explained, and everyone frowned. Albus, you said you managed to banish to the Arctic, but if it devours magic, how did you accomplish this? McGonagall asked, clearly having an idea. This creature has a maximum range that it can devour magic within. I used this to send a certain area of space to the Arctic that included the creature's location without directly using magic within its field. Hold on, you said it has a range? Nick said with his eyes lighting up. That is correct. What have you figured out? Dumbledore asked, hopeful. I may or may not be able to erase an area of existence if I can trap the creature in an area with looping space that should kill it, but it's a gamble, a large one at that. The enchantment, if you want to call it that, is highly volatile, so if even the tiniest speck of magic touches the ring, it could go off and take whoever was holding it with it alongside 20 feet of existence. Nick said seriously, as everyone in the room looked horrified. Why would you create such a thing? Flitwick asked in confusion after getting past the horror that is an existence-erasing item. It was a failure I created in my first year at school that I never had the suicidal inclination to recreate. You need to understand that while I had the theoretical limits for the enchantment method I use, it was just that, theory, so I could only determine fact from fiction via experiments, that one just ended poorly. Nick explained honestly. If possible, I think it best if we avoid resorting to such dangerous actions. However, the idea for a looping space might work to keep the creature contained until we can safely destroy it. I will seek aid from my old friend Nico in setting such a thing up. Dumbledore said seriously. I also like not being erased, so you have no arguments from me, though I have a large stockpile of star metal that might help if you require it. Nick offered, since if it meant that abomination's eventual destruction, he was all for generously donating to the cause. That will be most appreciated, since the metal will make the work much easier. Dumbledore said with a smile. With that settled, I have a gift for you all, since I won't be participating in the standard Christmas gift giving this year. Nick said as he took out several small vials with a small stone in each. Chapter 457, Stones. These stones were barely the size of a pebble but seemed to glow with an eerie pale light. These small stones are the congealed magical energy taken from a certain star that shines from the sky at night. What they can do, though, is the really interesting part, however, as each one of these things can be used to empower the effects of a single piece of magic, be it potion, spell, enchantment or alchemy, permanently. The catch, however, is that the stone is gone after a single use, and getting more is a pain in the neck like you wouldn't believe. Nick said with a smirk. How difficult could it be if it is from a star that shines every night? Lupin asked, confused. So, as is common knowledge, the world spins on its axis and rotates around the sun. But relatively speaking, the stars don't move from their positions with the Earth in this orbit, and some actually only shine dimly, if at all, during very specific times of the year. These stones come from one such star and thus are a huge pain to get. This is obviously not my entire stock of the stuff, but very precious nonetheless. Nick explained honestly. Nick had been lucky enough to find this star when he was experimenting with the Twilight method, but to his dismay the star in question only popped up in the sky for a week every year. I think I know the perfect thing to use this for, thank you. Dumbledore said as he gazed at his own stone in fascination. The rest of the professors also expressed their thanks at the gift, which, while simple and the same for each of them, was also in a way personalized. The light material itself was unique as far as Nick could tell, as it held no magic itself and had no forms it preferred, but could empower any magic it was used with greatly. Nick himself had been tempted to use it on his realm, but he found out the hard way that it would have very little effect due to the nature of the realm. It had stopped being a simple enchantment after experiencing so much growth since its first creation and was now a sort of pocket reality or plane of existence. Besides that, though, Nick didn't find any of his usual works worthy of the material. As far as he was concerned, nothing below mythical grade was, and he didn't have any others at the moment. His wand was also not magical by itself but a focus for his magic that in a way siphoned off his own magic to function, not enough to matter, but the point stood. Perhaps I should think up a new mythical ring, but what? Nick thought offhandedly as he left the office. With the abomination needing to cross the ocean again, they had a bit more time to prepare, so Nick wasn't stressed about it. Plus, if the whole space looping thing worked out, then the abomination should starve to death even without their assistance if given enough time. Even if it didn't work so well, Nick still had options to get rid of it if he threw caution to the wind. The one he mentioned was one of them, but he could always stuff the abomination with enough magic for it to detonate in a grand explosion that will probably cause international issues between the Muggles. That doesn't even begin to cover the effects that such a vast amount of magic being unleashed in an area would do to it. Not even Nick knew the answer to that question, as there was no recorded instance of such a thing happening that he knew of. Still, once he got back to the workshop, Nick meditated while pondering a mythical item to create. I wonder if that would even work, he thought as he had an idea. Standing up, he grabbed an ingot of mithril and turned on the furnace and waited for it to warm up before switching the flame to purgatory flames and tossing the mithril in. Once the ingot was melted into an eerie white puddle, Nick transferred it to a wide flat mold so that he could let it cool into a thin sheet of metal. Are you sure you want to do this? It may have far-reaching complications if you do. Celebrimbor asked worriedly. Nick nodded. If it works, it might give me another ace up my sleeve. Nick said honestly. That's if it works at all. You might instead only create a cruel item of the darkest sort. Celebrimbor warned seriously. It's a gamble, but one with a very high payout if it works as intended. Nick said with a smirk. Chapter 458, Underworld's Grasp. It was a strange idea that Nick had out of nowhere, but as he said, would be of great help to him if he could succeed. The idea was simple really, an enchanted item with the ability to extract souls from a living body and let him use them as raw material or fuel for his creations. Celebrimbor was also correct that if it didn't come out correctly, then it would indeed be a tool of the darkest sort. This wasn't a situation like how Nazgul was created on accident and thus was neutral in nature despite its original abilities. No, Nick was purposefully trying to create a thing capable of literally tearing out souls and then allowing him to use them for his own means, which was inherently selfish and thus leaning towards darkness. If it goes badly, however, the resulting creation will have an insatiable hunger for souls and be a huge threat that will need to be destroyed. It was a risk to be sure, but Nick was hopeful that it would work out. Once the metal sheet hardened, Nick went to work measuring and marking it for each of the individual pieces that needed to be made. 3 pieces for each finger and 2 for the thumb, a large piece for the knuckles and another for the back of the palm. Once they were measured, Nick got to work cutting the pieces out using a careful application of the severing charm that left him with a slight excess on the pieces, but he could always remove it later, but he couldn't add more. Tossing the pieces into the furnace to heat up again, Nick waited for them to become malleable before removing them and carefully using his hammer to shape the pieces to fit around his hand using a transfigured metal version of his hand. Once the pieces were roughly fit, he started to file off the excess metal and sand the sharp edges. After that was done, he put it all back in the furnace to reheat before punching holes through certain locations so he could rivet the pieces together in an articulated fashion. For the rivets, he remelted the excess metal and created thin pins that he flattened on one end before using his hammer to flatten the other after it had passed through the holes he punched previously. The exception to this was the 2 holes he punched on either side of the bottom of the palm piece that he riveted through a dragon hide glove, completing the form of the item, a gauntlet. Now for the risky part. Nick thought and started to channel his spiritual energy. He used everything about souls as well as his understanding of Nazgul's ability to create this, along with the elvish words, Fia, Spirit, Mapi, Grasp, Wanwei, Taken, Yut, Use, and Karm, Creation, to enchant the item with a stern expression. The final result was better than he had hoped, but not exactly as he envisioned. Gauntlet, Yunmo Mapi, Underworld's Grasp. Grade, Mythical. Abilities, Autozizing, Soul Plunder, Soul Solidification, Soul Manipulation, Ethereal, Bound, Nick, Growth. Mythical ability, Truest Self, grants the one it is bound to an instinctual understanding of a soul's true form. Description, a powerful artifact that grants allows the use of souls in enchantments and creation. System Appraisal, a complex artifact with the power to wield the soul as a tool and will carve its name in myth created by an established ring smith. Holy shit! Nick exclaimed with a dumbfounded look as he read the system's appraisal of the thing he created. It was as if his idea had been done in a different way than he had thought it would, not that he was complaining. This was definitely more useful than how he had envisioned it, as knowing the true shape of a soul allowed Nick to not only find the perfect use for them but also deepen his understanding of them. He had to ponder over why it ended up like this, however, as he couldn't figure it out off the top of his head and needed a few moments to find the crux of the change. Nick figured out that the reason it turned out like this was because he had carelessly added his knowledge of souls without restraint, including what he learned from the Daedric book. Daedra were the embodiment of rebirth, and so even that small piece of knowledge that he had was overwhelmingly close to the true understanding of the subject compared to the more mundane knowledge on souls he had. Oh, the things I can do with this! Nick thought with a wide grin as he stared at the ghostly gauntlet on his anvil. Chapter 459, Soul Experiments. Nick put the gauntlet in his realm before leaving the workshop to go find a few lesser creatures like rats and beetles to use as test subjects. He obviously wasn't going to walk around with something like that in the open, as literally everyone will be able to see it and get curious. The professors would definitely notice that something was wrong with it almost immediately. It would only take a small leap in logic to figure out that he was doing something related to souls, which was an almost taboo subject to study. It wasn't illegal so long as one avoided human experimentation, but that didn't mean it didn't have a heavy aversion attached to it. So rather than deal with that, Nick simply chose to secretively collect a few creatures no one would miss and use their souls as the basis for his experiments. There was one thing that Nick knew already thanks to Nazgul, which was that not all souls were the same. For example, the souls of animals without intelligence such as rats and beetles were pure and white, as they cannot do dark arts if they can't know what that is. Intelligent souls like those of the acromantula were silver, white and / or some other shade of color based on their innate traits and whether they did dark arts. Acromantula souls by their man-made monstrous nature were silver and purple, for example. Nick wasn't going to capture an acromantula quite yet though, as he wanted to get a real feel for handling the gauntlets first. It wasn't particularly hard to collect a dozen or so rats, since he merely needed to find a warm semi-isolated spot in the castle and force them out of their burrows. Generations of rats had lived and bred in Hogwarts, so they had in a small way evolved to the climate of the school and thus had habits that he could exploit. Beetles were just as easy to find as the hardy creatures dug under stones into the earth when winter came to stay warm. Nick simply flipped a few rocks and got to collecting. Nobody found it odd that he was doing this either, as so many things called for beetle eyes that shops sold them by the scoopful, A/N, that's an actually canon thing. As for the rats, he captured that too was a regular occurrence for students in the higher years, as they needed test subjects for various magical things. Nick brought the creatures into the realm and slipped on the gauntlet smoothly as it clung to his hand snugly. Let's start with a beetle, he thought as he plucked out one of the small insects with his uncovered left hand. Carefully he pinched the tips of his fingers on his right hand around the beetle, and to his surprise the gauntlet sank into the beetle's body like it wasn't there. It stopped once Nick felt a sudden spike of feelings was the best way to describe it. It was as though he was seeing something without using his eyes, in roughly the shape of a beetle in between his fingers without actually seeing it. It was a disorienting experience to say the least, and it was only after he lifted his hand and extracted the soul from the beetle that he could actually see the soul. It was a bright white mass of shapeless energy despite what his new sense was telling him. Checking the beetle, Nick found that the body was still very much alive if motionless, and he wondered if putting the soul back would make it as if nothing had happened. So that was what he did, and as he had thought, the beetle continued doing what it was before he extracted its soul. This was interesting, as Nick wondered what would happen if he took out the soul and then killed the body before trying to put the soul back. He thus repeated the test, except this time he used a tiny amount of electricity to stop its body's heart. He waited a few moments before trying to place the soul back into the body, but this time there was a different reaction. The beetle's body twitched horribly for a few minutes before the corpse exploded, and he assumed the soul dissipated. A dead body can't hold a soul, then how do inferi work? Nick pondered with a frown. Inferi were supposedly created by trapping a soul in its dead body that was then forced to serve the one who killed them. Either this wasn't actually how that worked, or there was something about the process that was different than what he just tried. Noting this disparity, Nick banished the exploded remains of the beetle and grabbed another. Chapter 460, Soul Experiments, 2. This time Nick took the soul from the body and killed the body before immediately stuffing the soul back into the body rather than letting the death set in first. Unlike the first time, the beetle didn't twitch or anything after the soul was replaced, and even went about what it was doing previous until its body lost all energy and the death state it was in caught up to and dispersed the soul. So a fresh corpse will still function for a while before the dead state of it forces the soul occupying it to disperse. He thought, intrigued. Next he grabbed a rat and redid the previous 3 experiments with similar results, if more dramatic and drawn out, since this soul and body was larger and stronger. Now to see what would happen if I swapped the souls of a rat and a beetle. Nick thought as he retrieved new test subjects. First he retrieved the beetle's souls since that was the easiest, and then he took out the rat's soul while leaving the beetle's soul in the living rat body. Immediately the rat body started to violently change as the fur all fell off and the skin grew dark and hard while the rest of the body took on beetle-like properties. Nick didn't waste any time stuffing the rat soul into the beetle's body as well after seeing this result, and watched as both bodies violently mutated and shifted in size and appearance. After 15 minutes both bodies looked nothing like their original forms. The rat body was now half the size and had thick hard carapaced skin, while a third pair of legs had grown out while the eyes had divided into two for a total of 4 eyes on either side of its head. It was a monstrous thing that looked like it fit in the magical world perfectly. The beetle body on the other had died from the drastic shift in anatomy that clashed with the pre-existing stuff. Was it because there was not enough biomass for the transformation to finish, or was the soul too different from the body for the changes to finish to begin with? He pondered as he dissected the body to find the anatomy mostly hollow, which he figured was the cause of death. The rat body on the other hand was slow-moving and, for lack of a better word, retarded. The beetle soul is clearly unable to handle the strain of piloting a larger, more complex body. In fact, I believe that this rat body is pushing the limits of its ability to adapt. Nick noted seriously. Nick then grabbed another rat and beetle before extracting the beetle's soul and placing it in the rat's body without removing the rat soul so he could observe what would happen. The body thrashed and made ungodly sounds for a good 30 minutes before it stabilized and began to mutate like the previous experiment. This time, however, the changes were much less drastic and the body remained mostly rat-like and even gained some size in addition to its new armored body. So the rat soul devoured the beetle soul and took on some of the latter's properties, causing the body to change into an overall more powerful creature to match the newly empowered soul. Nick noted and then had an idea. He then extracted the new soul that was no longer rat or beetle and then stuffed it in the struggling body of the first experiment. The body also thrashed about violently for some time as the two souls battled to devour the other, and once that was finished the body began to mutate again. The imperfect rat-beetle fusion that it was previously began to shift into a new, more powerful form that discarded the unneeded traits and added the more advantageous ones. The resulting abomination was a fierce-looking creature the regular size of a rat with thick black armored skin and streamlined body, with a terrifying-looking head of split jaws like a beetle with a rat's teeth. The more powerful rat soul has grown drastically after devouring the two beetle souls but is showing signs of instability. Nick noted. Now let's see what happens if I dramatically change the shape of a soul myself without adding a new soul or having the original devour another soul. Nick thought eagerly as he was learning so much from these experiments. For example, he learned that souls could forcefully fuse if trapped in the same body, as well as that the soul in the body heavily determined the shape of it. For this next experiment, Nick hoped to see if he could modify a soul and then put it back into its original body and get a more powerful version of that creature at no extra cost on his part. Chapter 461, Soul Experiments, 3. The way he intended to do this was a bit special, however, as he wanted to shift the true shape of the soul much like one would edit an image or sentence. Nick wanted to remove the parts that felt redundant and shift that mass to what he saw as improvements. The beetles, for example, lacked magical abilities and were basically at the bottom of the food chain for animals. He wanted to see if it was possible to change that somehow. His first experiment in this regard had him take out the soul of a beetle and then begin to clumsily, he will admit, manipulate the shape of the soul. First he removed the middle set of legs and used that mass to improve the shape and power of the remaining 4 slightly. Then he began to narrow the beetle's body shape with it coming out like a needle-point arrowhead. He then put this newly modified soul back into the body he took it from originally and watched as the body began to change shape. The final result was fatter than he made the soul's shape, but the general form of the beetle remained as he designed. Unfortunately, the bug died shortly afterwards from the organs not being designed for this new body type. I wonder if that is true for the other creature as well, but it isn't showing signs of it because the failures are taking longer to manifest. Nick pondered while looking at the rat-beetle hybrid abomination. The creature didn't seem to be in pain or suffering and was even wondering about in the isolated area it was in a bored manner. Nick cast a medical spell he learned from Slytherin's library that allowed one to gaze into the internal workings of a body without harming the one it was cast on. It was merely one of the many high-end specialized spells that Nick had learned from absorbing the man's life's worth of knowledge. Slytherin didn't do it by half when writing down his life in the library, and it was almost as if he was personally teaching Nick all that he knew. Mana-wise, Nick was weaker than Snape and most of the professors, but in terms of knowledge he likely only fell short of Dumbledore in the school. That was after only completing half of Slytherin's library to boot. Nick wasn't sure whether or not Dumbledore had more or less knowledge on magic than Slytherin. What he did know was that after he finished absorbing the contents of the library he would definitely have the knowledge of a powerful Tier 4 wizard at the least. Anyways, the spell allowed Nick to see that not only was the abomination's organs not slowly failing, they even seemed to be improved instead. What is the difference between the two transformations? Both are clearly unnatural, but one caused the death of the test subject while the other only made it stronger. Nick pondered seriously. It was a fascinating difference that fueled his curiosity in the subject of souls even further, as it was such a complex and wide topic. Even in the first half of Slytherin's library, Nick had seen only 3 mentions on the topic, and those were merely uses of it the founder had personally seen. Sadly, the medical magics that were in the first half of the library focused exclusively on the mind and body, such as curses, poisons, and mental wounds. Even in the library of Hogwarts there was a tiny amount of books on souls, and all of them -2 were books on dark magic. After pondering it for a moment, Nick developed a theory on why the 2 different approaches to the same result had different results in the end. Basically, all souls knew what they, and by extension the body, was supposed to be like, and acted on the body to manifest this. By forcefully altering the shape and function of the soul, Nick had introduced imperfections in this knowledge that translated to the body not being able to cope with it, as some parts didn't know they needed to change as well. In the case where one soul devoured the other, however, the entirety of the soul was overhauled and improved, thus meaning there were no imperfections in the design of the knowledge. Nick could only frown at this though, since if true it meant that to manually alter a soul he needed to either change literally every facet of the soul's form himself, which was way more effort than it was worth in the case of simple bugs or rats. Or he needed to limit the changes to the soul to less fundamental things like small upgrades to the legs. Chapter 462, Soul Experiments, 4. Nick decided to put any further experiments in that particular regard in his long list of things to do later before moving on to his next and admittedly highly illegal experiment, trying to turn the mundane magical. One of the 3 pillars of magic was the soul, so Nick was curious if it was possible to add magic to a mundane creature's soul and then put the soul back into the creature in order to induce a magic-centric mutation in the creature in question. If it worked, then it meant that it may even work on muggles. He doubted it was enough to genuinely create a wizard from a muggle, since they would lack a magical core and circuits, but it might be enough to possibly allow that muggle's offspring to develop them instead. If it worked out, then Nick imagined that it would only take him 4 or 5 generations to transform most of the human race into wizards. Just thinking of all the muggle geniuses that could have revolutionized the wizarding world by this point, if that had been the case 1,000 years back, was enough to make Nick shudder. The method Nick chose to introduce magic to the soul was a simple one, but at the same time dangerous. He summoned a small jar of frost salts from elsewhere in the realm and grabbed a beetle from his dwindling stock, as well as a single grain of frost salt. Using his gauntlet hand to extract the soul of the beetle, Nick used his opposite hand to carefully drop the frost salt grain into the center of the soul. Immediately the soul started to turn blue and grow in size in his grasp before bursting like an overfilled balloon. The soul showed clear signs of integration, so why did it explode? Was it too weak to handle it, perhaps? He wondered curiously before drawing out the soul of the abomination and repeating the experiment, since this time the soul was far stronger than before. Once again the soul immediately started to turn blue after the grain of frost salt was added to it, and once again the soul began to swell, only this time it stopped at double its original size and stabilized. Nick frowned, however, when he noticed that a vast majority of the soul remained white, which was the normal color compared to the blue of the magic. He didn't want to risk destroying the soul though, and didn't try to add more frost salt to it, and instead pushed the soul into the body and waited to see if it would manifest magic. The body came to life after the soul was placed into it, but quickly started to shiver and shake as it breathed out cold mist. Soon enough the creature died, however, and after dissecting it he could only declare this experiment a total failure. The soul caused magic to appear in the body all right, but the problem was that the cold magic had nowhere to actually go, since the body wasn't made for it, and so ended up freezing to death from the inside out. While a strong enough soul can indeed gain magical properties, the body will end up damaged from the rampant magic it produced inside it. Nick thought with a sigh and finally called it there for these types of experiments, and moved on to adding the souls to his enchanted items, which was his original purpose for creating the gauntlet. Doing so caused the souls to be broken down into a sort of pure energy, however, rather than giving the enchantments living properties. The size and quality of the soul also determined how much benefit the enchantment gained from it. Using the rings of protection as a base, Nick determined that a normal rat soul was worth 4 beetle souls but less than a Goliath beetle soul. This didn't reference the actual species of beetles known as Goliath beetles, but rather the soul that came about by feeding one beetle soul 3 others. The final resulting soul was far more powerful than the sum of its parts, and interestingly enough didn't cause almost any changes in the normal beetle body it was in, save doubling it in size. Nick did the same for rat souls to create a Goliath rat soul, and found that such a soul was massively more powerful than the sum of its parts. Is it possible that this is what that monster created from the ritual experienced? If so, then it explains why it can use magic like it is a limb, since its soul is extremely powerful. Nick thought with a bit of horror, as if it was true the thing's soul was likely tier 5 or gods forbid tier 6 in power. Chapter 463, Next Match. After concluding his experiments with the gauntlet, Nick got rid of all the leftovers while feeding the souls of the still living creatures to a single rat before extracting the now very powerful soul and using it to empower the anklet he wears on his leg. Nick hadn't forgotten this particular piece of protective gear but refused to use it unless it was an emergency, since the longer he went without doing so the more powerful it got. As it was at the moment, using it would make it seem as though time had stopped for Nick for all of about a minute. That was what a total loss of kinetic energy within 20 feet would look like if one was indoors after all. After the empowerment by the soul, however, the range grew to nearly 60 feet in every direction. Having the realm break down and assimilate the corpse's base components, Nick stored the gauntlet away and left the realm. With a flick of his wand he knew the current time and started to head towards the Great Hall since it was dinner time. Nick listened in on the conversations as he walked to his regular seat at the Gryffindor long table. Seems the Ministry is keeping the news on the creature under wraps for now, no doubt to take credit for it after we deal with it, he thought with derisively. The more his knowledge and power grew, the more Nick started to disdain the petty methods that Fudge and the Ministry used to keep the British wizarding community reliant on them. He understood why they did it, of course, but that didn't mean he didn't find it pathetic. As much as everyone tries to ignore it, the fact of the matter was tricks only counted for so far, and only having true recognized power really held weight. It was why Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and even Voldemort were all able to sway the hearts and minds of so many people. Each and every last one of them showed their power and ambitions, and people naturally fell in line behind them to follow those same ambitions. Simply having an ambition but no power behind it was unsustainable, and it showed as the Ministry was constantly scrambling to keep hold of its place at the head of the wizards, but it was a tenuous affair. Shaking his head to remove such thoughts, Nick sat down at the table next to Harry. "Hey, did you hear? The next match has been decided already," Ron said excitedly between messy mouthfuls of food. "Oh? Which ones is it this time?" Nick asked curiously. "It's the Mermen and the Krakens. The captains of the teams put out the announcement earlier when you were doing whatever it is that you do by yourself," Ron said seriously. "When's it scheduled?" Nick asked with interest. "This coming up Saturday, supposed to be better than the last game since they've had longer to train," Harry said with a shrug. "It might be, but it's not a very complicated sport, so there's not a whole lot to improve upon," Nick said honestly. "That is where you are wrong, my reclusive friend," Fred chimes in from further down the table. "The rules aren't very complicated to understand, true, but the things that we players can do is much broader and intricate. We had affectionately called them BTs or blitz techniques if you don't like the short version. Can't really go into details since we don't want to ruin the surprise, but it's gonna change the whole game," George says with a wide grin. "Pretty sure I know what you are referring to, but I'll see for myself this upcoming Saturday," Nick said with a shrug. The week moved by quickly after that as Nick focused on trying to complete his mission as quickly as possible, as he was starting to get close to the 250,000 rings of protection needed for it. He also recovered a hefty amount of points as a result, and was eyeing the book on magical cloaking he saw previously since he was still very much interested in it. The day of the match, Nick woke up as per normal and took on his animagus form before vanishing from the dorm after he got dressed. Nick had discovered that after he gained the celestial bird form he got a slight improvement to his natural vision and related bloodline abilities, but could only gain all the benefits of the species if he was in the form. This meant no elemental teleportation unless he took on his animagus form. A little inconvenient to be sure, but nothing he couldn't work around by getting a little privacy. Chapter 464, Goldstein. It was funny how no one seemed to question the strange new magical creature that flew around the castle in the morning every day, or how Nick seemed to suddenly be able to teleport when he was out of sight. The only ones actually aware of the situation was the staff of the school, and they had been keeping it quiet, just like with Lupin's new state. Nick had been very pleased with his animagus form, all things considered, as it felt natural to him and even gave him a few new abilities while in it. The deal with Fudge and the Ministry regarding Blitzball was also starting to create a heavy inflow of money into his account at Gringotts from all the international deals that went through and money being spent on the sport globally. It was sporadic at first, but as things went into full swing globally with promotions, merchandise, and construction cost for the fields, all started to steadily flow a stupid amount of money into his account. Nick only made about 2 nuts to a galleon, but when that was applied at a global scale he was making hundreds of galleons every single day at this point. Nick was nowhere near the most rich person in the country, but in about 3 years he predicted he would be at least close to having that amount of money. The only real stress that Nick had at the moment was the ever-approaching arrival of Zeus and this new magic-eating abomination in the form of Bellatrix Lestrange at peak health and beauty. Oh yes, the ritual fully restored her body to its most perfect state, which in addition to the fact she was actually very attractive naturally meant the creature was much like the vibrantly colored animals in the wild, pretty to look at but lethal to mess with. Still, Nick wasn't all that interested in such things despite his own teenage body starting to cause him problems in that regard. While everyone else in his year was also hitting growth spurts and taking interest in the opposite sex, he had to deal with additional issues. For example, the fact that 4 out of 6 of his friends were female and his sensitive elven senses bluntly told him when they started their cycles. It was distracting to say the least for him to constantly have to ignore his biological instincts in this regard. He flew for an hour or so until it was time to head over to the blitzball field for the game that was set right after breakfast. He made sure no one was around before changing back to his normal form and finding a seat in the bleachers. While he waited, Nick waved his wand and caused the ice and snow on the seats to evaporate before the other students started to arrive. "When'd you get here?" Anthony Goldstein asked in confusion after being the second person to get to the bleachers. "A few minutes ago, even had time to clear off the frost from the rest of the seats while I waited," Nick said casually. Anthony looked around at that and found that indeed the seats were in fact totally clear of all snow and ice. "My in-law said I shouldn't compare myself to you, but you are really making the rest of us look bad with stuff like this," Anthony complained. "Oh? Who's your in-law?" Nick asked curiously. "You don't know?" "I figured he would have mentioned it, but then again he does get sort of focused when he is talking about magical beast," Anthony muttered. He shook his head. "Newt's commander is my great-uncle-in-law through marriage. Married my grand's cousin, in fact," Anthony said proudly. "Ah. So you are related to Newt then? Afraid he really never mentioned it during conversation," Nick said, understanding the situation. Anthony was distantly related to Newt and probably had Newt tell him not to make comparisons during a family reunion of some sort. "It's fine, I suppose, since I told him we weren't friends or anything like that," Anthony said with a shrug. "Don't really have much reason to have been friends with the schedule that we had in the first year and all the stuff I had to deal with at the time. Hell, I probably wouldn't even be friends with Luna if she wasn't as unique as she is," Nick said honestly. Anthony chuckled. "Yeah, that girl is something all right. Did you know there's a bet going around about whether or not she is special like you or genuinely loony?" Anthony asked, and Nick shook his head. "Sounds like the sort of thing a bunch of gossipy girls would do," he says with a scoff. Chapter 465, Mermen vs Krakens. Anthony laughed at that. "That describes them perfectly," he said in agreement. "Let me guess, it was probably started by whoever it was that wanted to bully Luna, right?" Nick asked with a knowing look. "Nailed it in one. I admit the rest of us should have probably put a stop to it but didn't want to clash with the ones responsible," Anthony said with clear shame. "I would have put a stop to it myself if Luna hadn't, so it doesn't matter," Nick said honestly. He meant it too, as if Luna hadn't put a stop to her mistreatment by her housemates he would have made everyone involved miserable. Anthony went silent at that, as he had heard of the way Nick had dealt with those that displeased him, and it sounded like an all-around bad time. He had never truly harmed any of them, but each time he acted he left those unlucky few scared and cautious of getting on his bad side again. It was at this point that more students started to arrive, and Anthony used this to end the conversation. Nick knew about it, of course, but simply couldn't bring himself to care and waited for the game to start officially. Soon enough water started to rise from the Black Lake and fill the field, while more and more people filled the seats. There were a few reporters and even surprisingly enough talent scouts who did a poor job hiding that fact. Still, the bleachers weren't nearly as full as they were during the first game, which made sense as foreign wizards with too much time hadn't traveled to the Isles to see it this time. Still, it's good to see the sport has so many interested, since it will boost my reputation greatly with the wizards that don't care for magical prowess," Nick thought with a small smile. It certainly helped that Nick was also profiting from the creation of the sport greatly and would likely continue to do so until he was richer than the church. Soon enough it was time for the game to begin, and like with the Quidditch matches, Lee Jordan was the announcer for it. The first team to enter the field was the mermen, who wore pale blue bodysuits with green seaweed-looking wraps around their wrists and ankles. "Oh, it seems the designer for this outfit read my research paper on the merfolk in the lake," Nick thought, surprised. It was a rather niche topic after all, so it was not the sort of thing that one would usually search out. Compared to the other books on the underwater people in the library, Nick's research report was the only one that took a neutral stance on the topic and only gave the facts as they were without any conjectures or theories. He didn't include the seal on their bloodlines though, since that would draw the wrong sort of ideas from the readers. To be honest, however, Nick hadn't expected anyone to really read his research and even less to use the information within to design a outfit. An interesting thing Nick noticed about the outfits was that the hands and feet were webbed and finned respectively, which would give a edge to the team's movement ability in the water. There was no rule against this sort of outfit modification, so until something about it was added it was totally legal. The Krakens entered the field after that, and they also wore body suits designed after the creature in question. The outfits were white with tentacles designs on the arms and legs, but interesting was the actual suction cups on the hands of the suits. That would help keeping a hold on the ball but would also make it harder to pass it as well, an interesting trade-off. Nick thought, intrigued by it. To his amusement, the person serving as the referee, which in this case was Tracy, was wearing a replica of his own silver body suit with a black badge on the front and back. I guess that will be the standard referee outfit for the sport from now on, Nick thought with a smirk. The game started and Nick got to see the effects of the outfit modifications in action. Like he thought, the mermen's outfits granted them superior speed all around compared to the Krakens, who struggled to keep up. It wasn't so great that extra effort couldn't fill the gap, but still quite noticeable. The suction cups on the Krakens' outfits on the other hand also did what Nick had expected, which neutralized the extra momentum behind the mermen's tackles when they had the ball. All in all, the game was actually very close in terms of outfit functionality, as both sides had an advantage in one way or another. Chapter 466, Blitz Techniques. Despite this, it was only halfway through the first quarter of the game that Nick saw what the twins were bragging about. When the right attacker for the Krakens was making it within scoring distance of the mermen's goal, the twins moved to tackle. Except when the Kraken went to break through the twins, they both grinned and did something awesome. One of them flipped onto their back with their arms open to anchor themselves in place, while the other placed their feet on the bottom of their brother's feet. Both then crouched and then sprang to full length in perfect synchrony, launching one of them at very fast speeds into the Kraken. Nick was impressed, since while it was theoretically possible, it required perfect timing between both parties or the forces would clash rather than blend. This maneuver was dubbed the Weasley Bolt by Lee Jordan, and Nick had to agree that it fit. It was clearly thought up by the twins to take advantage of their own synchronicity with each other. For anyone not so in sync with their partner, this technique would take a large amount of effort to learn, much less use in a match. The crowd went nuts when the twins did this, as not only was it awesome, but it even paid off as the Kraken lost the ball as the twin tore it from the suction-cupped hand holding it. This technique use seemed to prompt an all-out reveal of different techniques between the two teams. From the Krakens, there was a tackle dodge that involved spinning in place, a scoring technique that involved adding a spin to the ball so that the goalie had trouble catching it. From the mermen, Nick saw a suspiciously high amount of special tackles from the twins, and one goalie technique involving the goalie kicking the ball to one of their teammates instead of catching it. Nick had to admit that the twins' bragging wasn't for nothing, as this game would almost certainly create a precedent for special techniques in any future games. The game, like the first one, ended after only 2 quarters, with the scores being fairly close to each other. The Krakens had 7 points while the mermen had 6. The Weasley Bolt, as it turned out, was a costly technique, as it placed a great deal of stress on the leg muscles from the full exertion of strength used. As a result, the twins had trouble walking after they needed to walk once the game ended, since they used it another 2 times during the game. So what did you think? Pretty awesome, right? Fred asked after finding Nick once he finished changing in the locker room. I admit all that bragging might have something to it, but don't go getting a big head about it, Nick said with a shrug. Ha! We knew you'd be impressed, George said with a pleased smile. Muscula sauna, Nick said while pointing at the twins' legs. A warm orange glowing mist flowed from the tip of his wand and washed over them, causing them to sigh in relief as the pain in their bodies melted away somewhat. Now that's some good stuff, they exclaimed at the same time. I merely repaired the damage to your muscles at a surface level so that you'd both stop limping so much. It was distracting, Nick said honestly. Slytherin was thorough in his research and experiments if nothing else, and thus had a fix for all manner of injuries, including overexertion like what the twins were experiencing. Medi spells, Nick. Branching out, are we? Fred asked with a grin. Not that we're complaining, mind you, just surprised to see it is all, George said honestly. Knowledge is power, and you never know when it might come in handy. Besides, those potions that Madame Pomfrey gives taste terrible anyways, Nick joked, and the twins shuddered and nodded. On that we can agree, they said at the same time. The twins had a bad habit of getting injured or hexed in some manner due to their experiments in making prank items that as a result landed them in Madame Pomfrey's care. The woman had her own form of punishment for unnecessary injuries in the form of all of the potions she received from Snape being modified to have unpleasant tastes. It was a simple matter to do it, and the potion master got amusement out of it to a degree as well. He even went so far as to make special variants of the potions for the twins that were worse than usual. To be fair though, the twins regularly make nuisances of themselves and getting on his nerves with the similarity to the marauders they had. Chapter 467, Before the Break. Time passed by again after that as 2 weeks came and went with a few things happening during that time. The first was that there were 3 more matches between the 4 blitzball teams in Hogwarts, with the Krakens currently being undefeated. This had made an interesting dynamic in which the members of the different Hogwarts houses had mutual fandom for the same Hogwarts teams. Dumbledore was in a great mood as a result, since the interactions between houses lightened up considerably. Nick didn't have a favorite team or anything but made time to watch any games being held to relax. The second thing was that Nick had conducted the rituals he had found in Slytherin's library to improve his power base. The ritual of expansion reduced the size of Nick's magical core but made it produce denser and higher quality mana, despite putting him back at the start of the 3rd tier again. The ritual of clarity, on the other hand, expanded his magical circuits and strengthened them so he could use even more powerful magic without straining them from the sheer quantity of mana in them. So despite getting sent back to the start of Tier 3, Nick was more powerful than ever now. There was a slight problem that he hadn't accounted for when doing these rituals that almost exposed his elven nature. After the ritual of clarity was completed, Nick's presence grew greatly, and even while he was restraining it with the item he had made previously for that, a small amount leaked out, earning him confused looks from those that got within a certain distance of him. He was forced to destroy the previous item and create a new, more powerful version that got it under control, while he passed it off as the side effect of an experiment before. The third thing was that he had gotten far enough into the Daedric book to start binding his essence to the realm. He didn't, however, because being able to start the process didn't mean he should start the process. Nick was cautious enough to know better than to be hasty in making this decision, as one wrong move and he ceases to exist. Still, he was excited at finally reaching the starting point for this in terms of knowledge. Once he successfully became a realm lord, he could start thinking about the next logical step after that, reaching for divinity. After all, Nick assumed that by the time he completed the process of becoming a realm lord, he will already be tier 4 or, depending on Grindelwald, tier 5. The final thing Nick did was hand out all the Christmas gifts he needed to for his friends early, since he didn't intend to spend very long on the holiday. The gifts weren't very inspired or extravagant like his usual ones, but served his purpose and freed him from any obligations involving the holiday. Beyond these things, Nick mostly focused on honing his use of the Celestial Bird's abilities when he was transformed. Weather manipulation was still a huge mana hog of an ability, but at least while he was transformed it came more naturally to him. Elemental teleportation was by far his favorite, however, as unlike apparition there was no distance limit he needed to overcome. Thanks to this fact, he had been able to teleport all the way to France in a single go. Beau's batons specifically, as he appeared in an awkward fashion on the school grounds during a flying lesson. Ironically enough, there was a rather large commotion as the students and teacher of the class retaliated in alarm, thinking he meant them harm. In truth, Nick had merely chosen that spot because it was where he was during the pageant and had forgotten to take the other uses for it the school may have had. He flew away from the school while under heavy attack by a bunch of first years and a teacher, but he at least learned where the school was located now. Much like Hogwarts, the French school was also located in the countryside, far from any large Muggle establishments. The closest thing to the school, unlike Hogwarts, however, was a winery and vineyard that was covered in snow at the moment. Nick memorized his location in the sky before vanishing in a burst of electricity as he returned to Hogwarts. Meanwhile, back at Beau's batons, Madame Maxime was speaking with the teacher for the flying class about his appearance. Once he had left and things had begun to calm down, the teacher had started to notice things that they had overlooked in the heat of the moment. One such thing was that he looked as surprised to see them as they were to see him, which Madame Maxime thought pointed to an accidental teleportation on his part, since there are reports of young phoenixes doing so as well. Chapter 468, Fruit Tea. The problem she had, however, was that whatever it was that had shown up at her school was definitely not a phoenix. The details of its appearance was all wrong, and the element it used to arrive was also wrong. At the same time, it was also not a thunderbird either, as the colors were all off and it had a few phoenix-like traits. Despite her great knowledge of magical beasts, she simply had no clue what the creature that had shown up was. Perhaps Newt would know, she pondered after ensuring the creature hadn't done any harm. Nick didn't realize that he had indirectly sent Newt on a wild goose chase, as the magi zoologist would go searching for the unknown bird that had appeared in Beau's batons but would not be able to find it for a long time for obvious reasons. Even if he did know, however, he still wouldn't feel bad, as for someone like Newt, magical beasts were his life and the thrill of the hunt to find them was its own reward. Nick had returned to Hogwarts in a good mood, all things considered, as he had learned that not only was distance not an object for him, he could also reach anywhere in the world in an instant after having visited it at least once. Nick walked out of the workshop and was surprised to find Luna at the door with a basket of fruit. "Where did you even find fruit at this time of year?" he asked, confused at the sight. Luna tilted her head. "Professor Sprout has an enchanted garden of fruit and vegetables in one of the disused greenhouses, she let me pick a basket when I asked. She said like that was common knowledge. I don't get along very well with magical plants, so I try to avoid the greenhouses as much as possible. Nick said with an awkward chuckle. Luna smiled. I know, I was coming to bring you some food since you haven't been going to lunch very much this year. She said while holding up the basket. I think I have a better idea, come in and take a seat. Nick said with a smile as he stepped aside. Luna found her normal spot in the workshop and took a seat while placing the basket of food on the small table nearby. Dottie. Nick called and the house elf appeared with a bow. Bring me 2 cinnamon sticks, a tea kettle and 2 teacups. Nick said and the elf vanished with a loud pop. Luna tilted her head in confusion at the order as she couldn't understand what he was going to do. Nick merely smiled and went over to the basket of produce and took out a couple sand pears, apples, and lemons from it and tapped them with his wand. Immediately the fruits peeled and sliced themselves neatly before landing on the table. It's clean. Soon Dottie returned with what Nick asked for and left after getting thanked. Nick roasted the cinnamon sticks from a few moments with his flames to help release the flavor before tossing them into the kettle alongside the fruits and their juices. Nan. Luna watched in interest as he did all this, as she was starting to figure it out but hadn't even considered such a thing before. Once the kettle was full, Nick held it by the handle and rested his other hand underneath it where he created a flame to heat the mixture within. Soon a sweet and fragrant smell filled the air of the workshop as the water came to a boil within the kettle. The kettle started whistling to release the steam and Nick stopped applying heat to it and set it down on a stone kettle coaster that was there on the table. He then tapped the tip of his wand against the side of the kettle and sloshing sounds came from it. Once he was satisfied, he stopped and poured the mixture inside into the 2 teacups. It was an amber-colored liquid with little pieces of fruit in it that smelled sweet and warm. Give it a try. Nick said with a smile, and Luna gently picked up the cup and blew on the contents that were still quite hot before taking a sip. She smiled brightly. It's quite lovely, thank you. She said and blew on the liquid again. It's a genuine fruit tea, not at all like those strange drinks that mix actual tea with fruit. It's a personal favorite of mine I discovered during the summer break between my first year and second. Nick says honestly. Why not make it more often? Luna asked curiously. Chapter 469, Christmas Break. Nick shook his head. This is not the sort of thing to be made often, but rather on occasions when one feels like treating themselves. This way you don't lose appreciation for it. He said honestly. Too much of a good thing spoils it. Luna said with an understanding nod. Now then, let's see what else we have in this basket to eat, shall we? Nick said and began to look through the basket. He found cucumbers, tomatoes, carrots, and cabbage within it other than the leftover fruit. Looks like it's salad then. He said with a shrug. They ate and drank in relative silence before Luna took the leftover produce in the basket and left skipping. It was a warm and peaceful moment for Nick between his various different projects that he was working on. A good example would be the Ring of Protection mission he was on the precipice of completing the main part of, and he only had one more part that he planned to do before turning the mission in. The next part was to create an entire set of armor that was rare grade at minimum. The thing here was that since each part of the armor wouldn't be directly connected, they would all need to be rare grade to qualify. Assuming that he chose the gauntlet as the first piece, he was well on his way to that goal. Nick wasn't going to do that though, since if he was going to make an armor, he at least wanted it to be publicly usable. The gauntlet was a borderline taboo artifact with its functions, so he won't be exposing it so flippantly. Instead, he needed to make an entirely new set of armor from scratch. He had thought about just making it using the Twilight style, but chose to handcraft each piece since he felt like it was almost cheating otherwise. I'll do that during the break that starts in a day. Nick thought as cleaned up the mess in the workshop from the meal. After that, he left the workshop to go and hang out with his friends while all of them were in the school. It wasn't particularly difficult to find them as they were all in the courtyard playing in the snow. So what will all of you be doing for the holidays? Nick asked after nailing Harry with a snowball. Sirius is hosting a Christmas party, you are invited by the way. Harry said, returning fire. Tracy and I will be attending a few political parties like always before relaxing at home. Daphne said as she too launched a snowball at Nick. He was a slippery target though and dodged both attacks while preparing his own. I'll probably go to Sirius's party and stay at Hogwarts otherwise. Ron shouted while teaming up with everyone else against Nick. Hermione and Luna didn't participate but said that they were going to be spending the holidays at home. 4 against 1, hey? I like those odds. Nick called with a laugh as he drew his wand and went rapid fire on them. This caused the snowball fight to escalate until it became a full-on snowball war with anyone unlucky enough to be near getting dragged into it. Most of Gryffindor and some of Hufflepuff ended up split into two sides that hurled snowballs through the air in a gloriously over-the-top amount of powdered ice. It was only after McGonagall interceded that the war ended, but both sides had casualties. The twins were a favorite target and had a bunch of bruises alongside several other people. Nick only got hit a few times thanks to his inhuman reflexes, and that was mostly just because it's a bit hard to dodge a wall of snowballs aimed at you. Sure, he could have used a shield spell to block them, but that sort of removed the fun from a snowball fight. All in all, it was a good time to be had and a fun way to spend the remaining time they had together before everyone left for wherever they went for the holiday break. Like that, Christmas break started early the next day and all the students leaving boarded the train and set off. Like every year, the castle felt empty without all the students it normally held, and all but a few noticed it. Nick wasn't amongst that number, as he was in the workshop planning out how he wanted to do his armor. What about this? Nick thought as he transfigured a block of stone into a set of armor. The shoulders are too wide and will get in your way when you swing your arms. Celebrimbor said casually. Chapter 470, Armored Up. Nick had been going through various ideas with Celebrimbor in regards to the design of his armor, since the ancient elf was a renowned smith before he ever forged a single ring. This meant that while Nick had the knowledge he would need to make an armor, he lacked the experience in armor making that Celebrimbor had. Thanks to this, he didn't make the common mistake of creating a suit of armor that had flaws. If the armor wasn't for a specific person, then it didn't need to be made with certain facets in mind, like the shape of the wearer's body. In this case, however, Nick was making the armor for himself and thus needed to keep his own proportions in mind with his design. Using Celebrimbor's help, he had already removed most of the flaws in the armor that came from his design changes, and it was now a game of minimizing them. It is impossible to create a truly perfect armor at this time, since he was still growing and his proportions may change as well. This looks about as good as it will get. Nick thought after he changed the design again. It will serve for the moment, but never settle for less than your best after your body finishes changing. Celebrimbor said seriously. Wasn't planning on it, old man. Nick thought with a chuckle. What are you going to enchant each piece to do, and where will you start? The elf asked, ignoring the jab at his age. I will start with the greaves, and I was thinking maybe using a gravity enchantment to make the suit lighter on me so I can move faster. Nick thought seriously. Why not a spatial expansion enchantment so that each step you take counts as two? The elf suggested. Why don't I mix both then? Nick thought, and Celebrimbor agreed that would be the best option. Greaves, for those not in the know, is a form of heavy metal armor for the part of the legs below the knees that typically ended with armor over the feet that is called sabatons. Nick first chose the metal for the armor, which in this case was an alloy of adamantium and goblin silver, to give it equal parts sturdiness and magical conductivity. Next, he created molds for each piece of the armor so that he had a rough shape to work with that would save him a little time shaping the metal. Next, he created the alloy and channeled it into the mold for the greaves before waiting for the metal to solidify. Once it did, he used an exact replica of his leg to hammer out the inconsistencies and true shape of the greaves. All that was left at that point was to buff out any dents and to polish it up. Nick then repeated this process for all the rest of the armor pieces, which included the cuisses, thighs, falds, waist, cuirass, chest, pauldrons, shoulders, rear brace, upper arm, vambrace, forearm, gauntlets, hands, and finally the helmet. The full set of armor was made of 9 different pieces that he personally adjusted to his body and polished to a high shine. The armor was sleek and flowing with clear feather patterns from the top to the bottom of it. It was also a strange bluish color that the alloy had for some reason, not that Nick cared all that much. Now to enchant each piece and tie them all together. Nick thought seriously as he placed the greaves on his anvil. Nick chose 4 words to go along with his understanding and will for this enchantment: jailman, space, gravitime, gravity, andi, length, and renta, part. These words will help channel his will and knowledge more precisely as he strikes the metal with his anvil. The final result was pretty much exactly what he had planned on making, as once the rest of the armor was tied together, it will get a decrease in weight thanks to this enchantment. The same was true of the space expansion part of the enchantment that made each of his steps like 2 instead of the normal 1. In truth, he could have made that figure higher, but doing so ran the risk of getting disoriented every time he moved. At the current level, however, the shift in location was small enough to be mostly ignored, thus granting him basically doubled speed. As a bonus, the greaves were peak rare grade, which showed that they were as close to mythical grade as he could get without crossing that line. This is a good base to build off of that will allow you to make this armor even better than normal. Celebrimbor said proudly. Chapter 471, Thoughts. Next up is the cuisses, which I think I will add a simple balance enchantment to. Nick thought while setting the greaves to the side. After he mastered the Celebrumber style and gained near perfect control of his spiritual energy, he became much more efficient at crafting new items. Add on to this his current reserves of mana and he can now craft 2 brand new enchantments back to back before needing to refill his mana. He didn't need any tricks or cut corners in order to do this either, as he was easily considered a master smith by elven standards. Still, 2 enchantments back to back was the absolute limit of his energy reserves, so he waited a bit to regain some more mana. Not long, just 30 minutes or so before he started to enchant the quizzes as well. For them he used the 3 words, Ranta, Part, Luntha, Balance, and Steadime, Steady. With them he tied the enchantment for the greaves to the quizzes and created the balance enchantment that would make him quite hard to knock over while he wore the armor. The grade of this piece of the armor, while still rare, was only mid-rare at best, but Nick had expected this considering how simple the effect it had was. Nick was pleased about this, as if the rest of the armor was also rare grade, then by default the whole set will be counted as such as well. He relaxed as he waited for his mana to refill by sitting in his chair and working on the Daedric book he had. Nick was eager to fully absorb the information held within the book and start the process of becoming a true realm lord. The problem was that the book contained extremely high-end information that made it a pain to understand. In truth, Nick had a suspicion that he was having so much difficulty with it because it might be a higher tier of powers level of information. In that case it made perfect sense, as he was simply trying to skip a grade or 2 in terms of pure information without having the required background information to begin with. It was like a normal second-year student trying to learn a 6th-year subject. Was it possible? Yes, it was. Was it easy? Nope. In fact, it was extremely difficult, as that student would need to constantly fight with the subject because of lacking the context for parts of it. Nick knew this, of course, but he was helpless about it, as even Tier 4 knowledge was very hard to come by, not to even think about Tier 5 or 6. Slytherin's library was able to provide Tier 4 information and maybe a small amount of Tier 5 if Slytherin recorded anything after he basically turned himself into a lich. This gave Nick a leg up over most people, but compared to the likes of Zeus it was simply not even worth mentioning. This was what made becoming a realm lord so important to Nick. With that done, even Zeus would be nearly helpless to truly kill him, and that let Nick get the breathing room he would need to try and close the gap. Anyways, he made very little progress in this regard over the next 4 hours, as his mana refilled itself passively with every breath he took. That was the only real downside to having greater amounts of mana that was of a higher quality that Nick found. It takes longer and longer for him to recover after emptying his reserves as he grew more powerful. Nick thought it was a worthy trade-off, really, since it only made sense for it to happen. Perhaps that's why the higher-tiered being can't sustain themselves in this less mana-dense environment. Their natural consumption and replenishment of mana simply can't handle the small amount of mana, thus making them die slowly and painfully as their bodies drain other forms of energy to fill the mana need. Nick pondered curiously. This also explained why the golden apple tree in the vault had survived long enough for Rowena Ravenclaw to find and store it in a stasis field. Magical plants were much less complicated than people and thus didn't need as much mana to survive. It's possible that the tree was just barely hanging on thanks to this fact, and if it hadn't been found by my ancestor would probably be dead by now. Nick thought thankful about it, since that tree likely held the key to the higher tiers and he could tell it would be a pain to reach them on his own effort. Chapter 472, Runic Armor. At the end of his recovery time, Nick put away the book and cleared his mind of his distracting thoughts. He then grabbed the faults and set them on the anvil, not quite sure about this one actually. Any ideas? Nick thought to see if Celebrumber had any ideas. Nick roughly knew what most of the pieces were going to be enchanted to do, but the faults happened to be one of them that he was not quite sure about. The others were the pauldrons and the rear brace that he also wasn't sure about. Perhaps a flight mechanic of some sort, so you don't need to transform in order to fly. The old elf offered, and Nick thought about it for a moment before nodding. As much as it killed him to admit, Nick knew that his animagus form was not ideal for combat and was far more useful for retreating and stalling instead. It simply had no way to cast real spells in any manner that Nick could learn quickly, as it lacked the vocal cords needed to speak incantations as well as any sort of decent aim while holding his wand in its talons. Wandless silent casting might be a thing, but even people like Dumbledore can barely do it, and the magic is pitifully weak when they do so. Nick saw no purpose to learning it at the moment. Thanks to his animagus form, however, and the books on flight magic he had already read, Nick knew exactly how to enchant the faults for flight. He channeled this knowledge and his intent into his hammer and branded the faults with 4 words: Ranta, Part, Janes, Bird, Vial, Fly, and Guilu, Air. In a manner of speaking, Nick was actually creating a sort of runic armor that there was a scant few examples of remaining. This wasn't referring to plain enchanted armor, but rather the few times in history when each individual piece of an armor set was enchanted to be a part of a whole. The reason there are very few examples left in the world was because pieces got destroyed and thus the entire set was imperfect and incomplete despite what anyone may do to rectify this. Runic armor was also horribly difficult to make, so there was few times that it was created, and each of them was under the insistence of a rich or famous individual. Nick was sort of cheating in this regard, as he was using the word renta in order to forcefully tie the pieces and their enchantments together. In the normal creation of a runic armor, the entire thing needed to be inscribed with runes at the same time continuously from one part to the next without stopping to rest or recover. While this was possible, only those enchanters with long years of experience and grand amounts of mana ever succeeded in it. To a degree it is considered a lost art, as so few ever succeeded at it and passed on their knowledge to the next generation as well that no one has done it in centuries. That didn't mean that it wasn't considered the goal of almost every modern-day enchanter to accomplish. The funny part in Nick's opinion was that there were in fact 2 or 3 people that he was aware of that could do it if they wanted to: Dumbledore, Grindelwald and Flammel. Each had the mana and knowledge required to pull it off, but none of them felt the need to create such a thing. Nick completed the folds without any issue at all and even got a peak rare grade for them, which was good. After that came the helmet, which he already had planned out but needed to wait for a few moments to recover a little more mana. The enchantment for the helmet was basically an environmental type thing that allowed Nick to see, hear, and breathe in any condition he found himself in. The words for this were renta, suele, breath, sinome, place, sen, sight, and hloen, sound, which was one more than the other pieces of armor he had made so far. To his surprise, this resulted in a mythical grade item that could probably be considered an artifact of great value by itself. It did everything Nick wanted it to do and more, as the helmet also granted a sort of sixth sense as well as its ability for detecting danger. All things considered, it was a perfect tool for exploring foreign or unknown environments with harsh conditions. With it done, Nick called it a day and made his way to the Great Hall for dinner alongside Dusk and Steve, who was on a diet to thin. Chapter 473, Souls and Hallows. On the way to the Great Hall, Nick saw something that gave him pause. Helena was talking and smiling with Lupin in the hallway. Now that explains her absence a lot. I almost feel bad for the bloody Baron seeing this, he thought with a conflicted expression. On one hand he was happy that Helena found someone who she fancied, but on the other hand he felt that this was wrong for Lupin. Helena might be able to have a corporeal body thanks to the ring on her hand, but the fact remained that she was very much still a ghost and thus a terrible option for romance. As bad as it sounds, the entire purpose for finding a mate was to mate and create offspring. That was not an option for ghosts like Helena, so Lupin romancing her was the equivalent of cutting off his bloodline unless he chose to cheat on her, or they had a weird concubine type deal later with a living woman. Nick refused to interfere, however, as they were both adults and could make their own choices and did not need his opinion on the matter. Truthfully, Nick knew that this was likely to happen when he created the way for ghosts to have corporeal bodies eventually. The idea of resurrecting Helena didn't even cross Nick's mind, as that was the height of unnatural and dark magics. Undoing death was not something that should ever be done lightly in his opinion, as the natural order existed for a reason. Even the resurrection stone didn't truly cross this line, but merely drew the soul of the one summoned back to this world from wherever they were and allowed the holder to see and communicate with it. Even then, this placed the soul itself in great suffering the longer they lingered in this world, as unlike ghosts that were soul-bound to the earth by their magic at the time of their deaths, these souls were already passed on to the afterlife and thus no longer belonged in this world. The very world itself rejects them as a result and causes them agony for being brought here. In the end, Nick chose to let things run its course and ignore what he discovered. Speaking of the resurrection stone, Harry was still oblivious to the fact he was wearing it on his hand even now, which was kind of funny in Nick's opinion. All Harry knew was that it was an heirloom belonging to his bloodline and that it likely had magical properties at some point, but was seemingly useless now beyond sentimental value. Nick got more than a little amusement seeing the rare interactions between Dumbledore and Harry, where the old goat looked lost while looking at the stone. Not because he was horribly tempted to use it or anything, but because the longer he held onto the Elder Wand, the more he started to notice that Nick was right. The wand wanted Harry to have it and had been almost imperceptibly causing trouble to achieve this goal, almost. Dumbledore was not some ignorant greenhorn, however, and could see these small traps clearly if he paid attention. The only reason Nick knew about this was that the old wizard had told him about it in hopes of seeking help in this regard. Nick had simply repeated the warning he gave the old man previously: hand it over to Harry as soon as possible and it will be fine. Dumbledore was not happy with this advice, but he at least explained that he understood where it was coming from. What Nick was curious about was what would happen if Harry had all 3 Hallows at once rather than at different times like in canon. Would he actually become the Master of Death, or would nothing at all happen besides him just having 3 admittedly powerful magical items? Nick didn't know, but he was curious about it nonetheless. The cloak and ring clearly had some sort of resonance when used in tandem, not that Harry noticed. But it was incomplete and thus not fully able to manifest whatever it was trying to do. I will find out eventually anyways, so it doesn't really matter. Nick thought as he shook his head to clear out of his thoughts on the matter. The Great Hall was mostly empty since most of the students had gone home for the holidays. Nick sat down at the Gryffindor table with Dusk sitting on his shoulder as per normal and Steve on the other shoulder with a miserable look. Nick ignored that though, as the glutton had brought it on himself by allowing himself to get so fat and out of shape. Nick wasn't sure if being so fat could cause health problems in the creature and was thus strict in maintaining a diet for Steve to slim it down. Chapter 474, More Work. While most were used to seeing the sheer amount of food that Nick put away per meal, it still made some students uncomfortable. Nick couldn't help it though, as between his growing body and the workout that forging gave him, his caloric intake had skyrocketed to nearly beastly levels. This meal, for example, consisted of 2 entire roast chickens, a large bowl of greens, 2 loaves of bread and leg meat of an acromantula which tasted like high-quality king crab meat. That didn't even mention dessert, which was also quite calorie-intensive. No one knew what the acromantula meat was though, since the legs had been steamed and the carapace removed, leaving only the soft red and white meat on a platter. As far as everyone could see, it just looked like someone had used the growth charm on some crabs and cooked the legs. No one else could ask for the dish either, as Nick himself had provided the meat to the elves for it and there was only enough for him. After his meal, Nick retrieved Nazgul and went to bed for the night. The next day Nick went to work on the arm and shoulder parts of the armor. Specifically, he enchanted the right gauntlet to serve as an amplifier for his flame creation and manipulation bloodline ability. He used 4 words for this as well, in the form of Ranta, Nar, fire, Karasta, build, and Tur, control. The left gauntlet did the same thing as the right, but for his lightning bloodline ability instead. That piece used the words Ranta, Aglid, lightning, Karasta, and Tur for its enchantment. He then took the next 4 hours much like the previous day and worked on the Didrik book with slow progress just like before. He did however learn something that made him thankful he hadn't started the process recklessly after he reached that point. Once the process started, he was not able to leave the realm itself for at least 3 months, as his essence soaked into and permeated throughout the realm. The larger than realm, however, the more time this took, reaching up to potentially hundreds of years for the realms the size of the British Isles. Thankfully Nick's realm was considered extremely tiny and thus only needed 3 months if you give a day or 2 extra. Well, that kills any plans I had for summer, he thought with a sigh. Thankfully the process to grow a realm larger by assimilating others didn't take nearly as much time, as it was less expanding one's existence like binding a realm but more like digesting food to grow one's body instead. In theory the same result, but in reality it took more effort for one path than the other. The only time that it would take much more time was when Nick would assimilate the world into his realm in the future. That would require several years to accomplish, much like when Malagbal tried to assimilate Nirn into Cold Harbor. The process would take nearly a century to finish if Nick didn't want to break the Earth into base parts first, which he didn't. Still, it would be worth it in the end, as he would have an entire world with an already established ecosystem and civilization to himself rather than having to spend the time to do all of that himself. The best part of binding a realm was that it would be turned Didrik in nature, meaning that the realm would automatically form its own creatures from the font of its existence loyal to him. This included full-fledged humanoid Didra that would likely take after himself in form to a certain degree. Anyway, Nick put away the book after he finished recovering his mana and moved to decide what enchantments to use for the Vambrace and Rear Brace, since he was undecided. In the end, Nick chose to enchant the Vambraces for defensive purposes using 5 words each. These words were Ranta, Varia, Protect, Tirith, Guard, Torah, Mighty, and Turma, Shield. This didn't create a mythical grade set of Vambraces, but Nick could tell that they were only a hair away from it. The Rear Braces on the other hand were given an enchantment that raised the strength of the person wearing them. Nick used a total of 4 words for this: Ranta, Torah, Nid, Force, and Polda, Strong. These turned out peak rare grade as well and had the effect Nick wanted, leaving him satisfied as he called it for the day there and went to eat dinner. He was close now to finishing the armor, but it would take nearly 2 more days to complete fully, as the cuirass was going to be a bit special. Chapter 475, Ballad Enchantments. The next morning after breakfast, Nick got to work on enchanting the pauldrons with an environmental protection enchantment much like his self-created spacesuit had. Nick didn't want this suit of armor to grant him greater strength in combat, but rather to allow him to go anywhere he wanted without issue. Each and every enchantment on the pieces of the armor served this purpose in some way, including the ones on the gauntlets. With the pauldrons' environmental protection added to the set, this armor would become the ultimate tool for exploration and travel once he finished the cuirass. The 6 words he used for the pauldron's enchantment were renta, siyuma, void, lelame, travel, varna, safe, robin, wilderness, and berthas, adventure. This was the highest amount of elvish runes he had ever used for an enchantment other than when he was creating the Arda Milmi ring, and it showed. The final product took most of his energy to create and was nearing the middle point of the mythical grade, which was quite good all things considered. All that's left is the cuirass, and then this armor will be complete. It's going to be a bit difficult to complete on my own though. Nick thought with a frown. The enchantment for the cuirass is going to be a bit special, as it was going to serve as the core or heart of the armor and blend each of the enchantments on the other parts together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The way this was going to be achieved though was the really special part, as Nick was going to attempt a ballad enchantment. Ballad enchantments were not a part of the Celebrimbor style despite being closely related. The reason for this was because the old elf had never been able to do it himself. An example of ballad enchanting was the Song of Creation that he had sang while creating the Arda Milmi ring. It definitely fell into the same branch of enchanting as the Celebrimbor style, but was of a higher tier and more of an instinctual thing than a thing that could be learnt. One could not simply train to achieve it, but had to have the right stimulus and conditions inherently alongside an opportunity for this gift to manifest. Nick had been avoiding it after the creation of the realm, as he feared what it may do to him. Ballad enchanting was a sort of harmonic resonance from one's very essence with what they were creating, and as a result it was little different from broadcasting one's very essence aloud and exposed to the world. All it took was a single nefarious and correctly skilled being to interject during the song to cause devastating damage or corruption to his essence. Nick was fearful of this precise situation and was glad that nobody did such a thing when he created the realm previously. Then again, it also probably caught anyone aware of it off guard and thus unable to react. Such an enchantment was impossible to truly hide, as it was a worldly affair and was broadcast widely from the source of origin. This means that unlike last time, if the range of effect for this broadcast reached far enough, then people could attack him in the worst way possible through it, as they wouldn't be as caught off guard as the previous one. By singing the Song of Creation previously, Nick had unlocked the ability to actively ballad enchant, but refused to do so until now out of caution. This armor, however, deserved nothing less, and so he had chosen to do so for the first time actively. Your home on the island should suffice to muffle the ballad's range, thanks to the wards you have placed there, though I know not to what degree. Celebrimbor said solemnly. The old elf was the only person in this world who truly understood what ballad enchantments were as well as what they meant besides Nick. Due to this, he did not blame Nick at all for not using them more, and was just as concerned about potential attacks as Nick himself. The most famous attack on one singing a ballad enchantment was during the very creation of his own world, after all, by Morgoth, who corrupted all of creation and tainted many higher spirits. One of which was his lieutenant, and later the very one that killed Celebrimbor and his family while perverting his creations, Sauron. So the old elf was intimately familiar with the horrible things that could occur during the ballad's singing. The rise of another Sauron through Nick's corruption was a possibility that he was very aware and afraid of as a result. Chapter 476, Preparations. Nick thought about it and found the suggestion reasonable, since while he doubted the wards around the island could completely contain the worldly phenomena of a ballad enchantment, it should be able to limit it. I think this will work, but I will create a few precautions just in case. Nick thought before opening the Daedric book again to study it while he waited for his mana to refill. He didn't make much progress during this time, but he had expected this and so wasn't bothered by it. When he finally regained his mana, Nick stood up and transformed into his celestial bird form before vanishing from the workshop. His destination was the island, but was prevented entry by the wards that didn't allow for any form of teleportation. He expected this and wasn't surprised to see that he was outside the ward before gliding down into the ward without issue. Even if he couldn't teleport straight into the island, the ward wasn't going to stop its master from physically entering it either. Saram clearly noticed Nick, but after observing him for a bit chose to go back to sleep once she determined who he was. She had seen the craziness of the Ravenclaw family's magical talent and easily shrugged off the discovery that one of them figured out how to turn into a magical beast. Nick himself couldn't care if she was surprised or not, so long as she did her job, and smoothly glided to the manor's front yard before landing and turning back to his regular form. I need a few of the extra ward stones, he mentally reminded himself as he went in and headed for the enchanting room that held these things stored inside it. While large ward stones like the one in Hogwarts were rare and stupid hard to get, there was plenty of the smaller sort typically used in homes to hide the magical nature of the people living there. The stones themselves were actually fairly cheap and easy to get, but the really expensive part was getting a skilled warder to carve the wards into them. On the smaller stones typically used, it was delicate and fine work because it was almost like writing a 6-page essay on the surface space of a marble in terms of difficulty. Nick was going to use a small warding trick he found that ties several smaller wards together to get a stronger effect. Doing this for the room he was going to be conducting the ballad enchant in, he hoped to restrict the outflow of the ballad even further so that it didn't leave the island. Even if it did leave the island, the distance it would cover would be very small, so unless there was someone right outside the wards he should be fine. Nick used Daedric runes for the miniature wards since they were tied to the soul and essence closely and thus more capable of restricting the range than the other rune languages Nick had. He had to use a magnification spell and warder's pen in order to fully complete the wards on the small stones, but he did it and set the stone in place around the room before transforming and teleporting back to the workshop at Hogwarts after flying out of the island's wards. His arrival and departure from the island hadn't gone unnoticed, however, as while the Order of the Golden Sands wasn't going after him in hostility so long as he kept his head down, they weren't going to ignore him either. As a result, a sentry had been set in place near the island to keep an eye on any strange coming or goings from it while simultaneously trying to crack the wards as well. Both parts of this mission were going poorly, however, as besides the regular coming and going of the house elf, nothing entered or left the island until now. The progress on the wards was even worse, as not only was the ward in a language entirely unknown, but the wards were constantly shifting as well without any pattern, so without a stupid amount of luck no progress was able to be made. So when Nick showed up in his celestial bird form, the sentry was greatly startled and reported about it in great detail. The description that he gave sent a ripple through the Order's magi zoologists as they remembered a magical creature that caused a heavy blow to their order in the past after they tried to capture it. There was even a sketch of the creature in the records of the Order that, after getting looked over, made the one called the Elder scowl angrily. "We thought we had seen the last of that damn bird, but it seems the brat has managed to fulfill the rebirth conditions for it and now it's fucking unkillable. What a headache," the Elder said in a gravely voice that sounded inhuman. Chapter 477, Moves in the Background. "Should we try and erase him for breaking the terms we put forth?" a nearby woman asked seriously. The Elders shook their head. "The brat hasn't actually broken the terms we set, as we never said he had to stop growing, but that he needed to stop drawing attention to us, and while he was clearly pushing the limit with this new sport, it didn't reflect back on us at all. It doesn't matter if he did break the terms anyways, as the little bastard has gotten the support of the Flammels, Dumbledore, and even the entire royal clan of the vampires. If it was only one of these we might be able to handle the backlash for attacking him, but with all three the damage we would suffer is not worth it." The raspy and human voice of the Elder spoke from under their hood. The woman didn't say anything at that point, as she understood just how badly they were outmatched by the supports Nick was gathering for himself. A mid-tier 4, 2 tier 5s and whatever the royal vampires counted as compared to their own forces that had no tier 4s, and the only tier 5 is unable to leave the mana-gathering array without risking death. Meanwhile, the figure of a black-haired woman could be seen walking across the top of the sea to the north of the British Isles with a smouldering look of rage on its face. The creature was greatly angered by the fact that its prey had managed to affect it in such a way and force it away. It, the predator, had been repelled by its prey. This was an insult like no other in the creature's mind, as it fully believed that its prey should submit for consumption quietly. What angered it even further was that the place it had been sent to lacked any substantial magic, so the creature suffered hunger pains as it quickly burned through its supply to escape this predicament. It had thought of operating back to the land, but its many minds worth of memories told it that would likely use a dangerous amount of its energy, so it was forced to use a low-energy means of returning that was far slower. The really infuriating thing though was that it was being observed from far in the sky by what it considered prey, but whenever it moved to consume the prey it fled with what the creature knew to be a portkaya before another prey took its place observing. Nick was unaware of these things, of course, as he was dealing with his own work. For example, he was storing his astral anvil as well as hammer from the workshop since he needed them for the ballad. The normal anvil in the enchantment room of the manor simply couldn't handle the resonant force of the ballad and would be destroyed. This didn't even consider that after the ballad was started each piece of the armor would start sucking in massive amounts of mana to link together. Thankfully for Nick, using a ballad enchantment was akin to resonating with the world, so all the ambient mana was temporarily at his disposal in the area covered by the phenomena. On the island this was a substantial amount of mana thanks to the array gathering and concentrating it there. Once he got everything together, Nick transformed again and returned to the island, though before going in he flew over the nearby sea to see if there was any order members hiding nearby. He was in luck, as it would have it, as there was in fact one hiding under the magical cloaking. He instantly blasted that location with a huge amount of fire and lightning, which did the trick, as whoever it was died before they could figure out they were in danger. After checking the area again and finding nothing out of place, Nick was satisfied and flew into the island. It didn't take him very long to arrive in the enchanting room and start setting up the anvil and armor for the ballad enchantment. He took in deep breath as he held his hammer and raised it up before striking the cuirass. Much like last time, he began to sing and the mana in the air began to dance and sway in tune with his voice. It was a song without words but full of meaning and power, as his will and essence resonated with the world with each strike. The life on the island paused regardless if it was a powerful creature or an insect as the resonance rolled over them before getting stopped at the wards for the island and contained within.
Thanks for listening.